Hello everyone, welcome to the Australian National University's Malaysia Update 2020. I'm Ying Sing, a postdoc fellow at the ANU Malaysia Institute. This biannual update conference is hosted by the ANU Malaysia Institute based in Canberra, Australia. The institute was established in 2016 to develop research and collaboration on Malaysian politics and society, but builds on a long history of Malaysian scholarship at the ANU. More information about our institute can be found at malaysiainstitute.anu.edu.au. This year, we're working with Malaysia Kini in Kuala Lumpur on a theme of alternative visions for Malaysia. Although this conference is held virtually, the ANU is built on the indigenous Australian land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and we acknowledge and pay respects to the elders, past and present. The world is facing unprecedented challenge this year, and Malaysia is no exception. What are the roles of the arts and culture in time of crisis? And in what ways human beings feel, understand, and deal with mental challenges such as grief and loss? Today, it is my pleasure to host the Culture Update, which involves a 30-minute keynote address from the Malaysian theatre maker Joe Kokatas, followed by a 60-minute discussion with panelists and a Q&A session involving viewers here online with us today. Joe Kokatas is a writer, director, and actor based in Kuala Lumpur. She co-founded the Instant Cafe Theatre in 1989, and she's currently the artistic director of this 31-year-old theatre company, best known for its political satire, comedy, contemporary plays, and multicultural, multilingual theatre practice. During COVID-19, Joe Kokatas directed an experimental digital theatre, which is a virtual Zoom restaging of the seminal play Para, which deals with issues of race and privilege in Malaysia. Our discussant today is Dr. Simon Sun, a senior lecturer in art history at the Culture Centre of the University of Malaya. His broader areas of interest include comparative modernities in the arts, urban histories, and art historiography. He has written on various topics related to 20th century art across Asia, and he occasionally curates exhibitions. He is also a team member of the Malaysia Design Archive. I now cross to Joe Kokatas to provide the keynote address.
Thank you, Zingin, for that introduction. I'm here today to talk about art, culture, grief and loss in a time of crisis. I want to start off my talk today by playing two clips from the movie The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman. I know this is supposed to be a Malaysia update, but I have been thinking about this film a great deal. So let's go to Sweden first. The story, quickly, for those who don't know it. A knight returns from the Crusades to find that a plague has swept over the land and his country. Indeed, the world is on the brink of extinction. Block comes back from a life fighting what he believed was a holy war, to find it was all hollow. Death meets him on the beach. He plays chess with death to buy time. Then he sets off with a heavy heart to his castle. Along the way, he and his squire, the cynical and pragmatic Johns, sees how people are reacting to the plague. Johns is like many of us, by turns resilient, cynical, robust, fearful. Johns encounters a painter who paints images of the plague and death. He asks him why he paints such macabre images. Do we really need to see this right now, he asks. They also meet a group of actors doing their best to provide some joy and pleasure for their dwindling audiences. The next morning, on a green hill, Joff and his wife pluck wild strawberries, which they offer the knight in a bowl of fresh milk. Sitting with these simple people, looking into the bowl of milk and strawberries in his hands, he is filled with a strange happiness. He knows he can't cheat death, but there are moments of happiness he wants to try to remember.
Mikael.
Och känner du vad gott han luktar?
Jag ser så stadig att ta i. Du är en stadig bit du, en riktig akrobatkropp.
Ja, det här det är min man. Jo.
God afton.
God afton. Jag sa just till din hustru att du har en präktig son. Han kommer att göra dig glädje.
Ja, han är fin.
Nu ser du inte så högtidlig ut.
Jag ska minnas den här stunden. Stillheten och skymningen. Skål med smultron. Skål med mjölk. Era ansikten i kvällsljuset. Mikael som ligger och sover. Joff med sitt strängspel. Jag ska försöka komma ihåg vad vi talat om. Och jag ska bära det här minnet mellan mina händer. Lika försiktigt som vore det en skål breddfylld med nymjölkad mjölk. Och detta ska vara mig ett tecken. Och en stor tillräcklighet.
Vad ska det här föreställa?
Det är dödsdansen.
Där är döden.
Ja, han dansar iväg med dem allihop.
Varför håller du på med sådana klodderier?
Ja, jag tänkte man skulle påminna folk om det faktum att de ska dö.
Blir de inte glada då?
Varför i helvete ska han alltid göra folk glada? Man kan ju skrämma dem lite ibland.
Då blundar de och tittar inte på din tavla.
Du kan tro de tittar. En dödskalle är mycket intressantare än ett naket fruntimmer.
Ja, när du skrämmer dem.
Ja, de tänker de.
Och de tänker.
Då blir de ändå räddare.
Kila galopp i fan på prästerna.
Det är inte min sak.
Bara måla din dödsdans, du.
Men jag bara visar hur det är. Sen får var och en göra som man vill.
Tänk vad somligt folk ska bli förbannade på det.
Jo, det händer alltid. Då målar jag strax något roligt. Man måste ju leva. Åtminstone tills pesten tar den.
I want us just to remember these two scenes. I'll come back to them later. But first, I want to return to the year 2020. A coup in Malaysia in February toppled the 2018 government, the first new government in 60 years that had won on a platform of hope and change. The coup was a shady and complicated backdoor maneuver called the Sheraton move. The new government used COVID-19 as an opportunity to seize power effectively and with little fuss to govern despite a lack of legitimacy, delaying the opening of parliament for as long as they could. And to be fair, did a good job initially. They were widely praised at home and abroad for flattening the curve. And rightly so, it appeared, although detractors say they were simply implementing pandemic measures that had already been put into place. Whatever the reasons, Malaysia looked like one of the countries that had done things right. The Director General of Health, who did the daily briefings, became a local hero, with his image springing up everywhere, including murals on buildings. These were sometimes next to politicians, who were also being fetishized in the same murals. Feudalism is still very much part of our cultural makeup. It was telling that the first very public pieces of COVID-inspired art featured politicians. It is also telling, however, that it wasn't long before those same politicians were defaced. So not everyone wants to eulogize leaders here, and there is a healthy desire to keep leaders in their place. Mockery and satire is also very much part of our cultural makeup. This is a country where the folk tales of Sang Kanchil the mouse deer are very much loved. Despite his small size, he takes on the big predators in the jungle, especially the crocodile, using his wit, cunning, and small size to his advantage. He is a much loved prankster. This prankster spirit is very much alive still in Malaysia. This prankster spirit ran wild in the early days of the pandemic. The hapless Minister of Health quickly became an object of mockery in memes, tweets, and TikTok videos for claiming, amongst other things, that warm water was a good way to destroy the coronavirus. His demonstration of this on national TV was widely parodied. Many other ministers were also quickly lampooned for various gaffes. The Malaysian sense of humour was evident with the rapid spread of satirical responses. The level of anxiety that's apparent today hadn't kicked in yet. Instead, Malaysians were getting down to coping on their own as they usually do. The hashtag Kita Jaga Kita, we'll take care of each other, created by novelist Hannah Alkaf, was quickly adopted by the general public, and Malaysians rolled up their sleeves and organised food and goods to affected communities. All communities were taken care of, including transgender sex workers and other LGBTQ groups. But as the CMO turned into the EMCO, levels of anxiety rose. I'm not sure exactly when the first anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiments arose. A history of pandemics will reveal that xenophobia is part and parcel of pathogens. Organizations who had long worked on migrant issues were divided as to the cause. Some felt it was the work of government cyber troopers, set out to create a common enemy and unify the public against them. Others felt it was latent Malaysian racism. The government, however, was high-handed in the treatment of undocumented workers, rounding them up in army trucks and sending them to detention centers. Images of barbed wire, of crying women being herded onto trucks, and children as young as 5 years old in handcuffs spread quickly, despite efforts by the FRU to intimidate journalists. Foreign news agencies were accused of spreading lies about the treatment of undocumented migrants. Malaysians became deeply divided by these reports, and ugly xenophobia reached its apex with activists receiving hate messages and threats. Some argue that kita jaga kita should be kita jaga semua, asking that we take care not just of each other, but of everyone. The pandemic was bigger than all of us. Activists and artists worked together for several days of art and activism to celebrate the humanity of migrants under the banner Migrant Juga Manusia. The Migrant Juga Manusia hashtag trended on Twitter, but the migrant issue continued to divide and continues to divide people even today. The Refugee Festival, an annual festival that hasn't been in place since 2017, went online, but the organizers felt that many refugees did not want to participate for fear of repercussions. An Al Jazeera report on the treatment of migrant workers sent the government and half the population into a bitter frenzy. It became a country deeply divided. What was clear was that 60 years of race-based politics was translating itself into anti-foreigner sentiment. My theatre company did a Zoom production of a play called Para, a play that deals with race relations in Malaysia. In the play, 4 young friends of different backgrounds quickly become divided along racial lines. All it took was for one incident to split the friends and bring racial inequalities and a history of racial hurt and fear to the surface. If everyone is a pendatang or immigrant, asks one of the characters, then who is the tuan rumah? Who is the master of the house? All these anti-immigrant sentiments brought into focus our cultural baggage of deeply embedded racialized discourse and politics. As all this was going on, Malaysian forests continued to be quietly felled by illegal loggers, in cahoots with various state governments. Forests were destroyed in Perak by the newly appointed chief minister, or durian farmers in Pahang chopped down their beloved legacy trees rather than let rapacious state and royal agencies try to hustle the fruit of their long labour. Gazetted forests such as Hulu Langat in Selangor, home to some of Malaysia's indigenous people, was de-gazetted for condo development overnight by the state and royal families acting in collusion as ordinary people stood helplessly by. This piece of art by Orang Asli artist Shak Koyak is not a new piece, but reflects the helplessness felt by many in his community. So weariness was beginning to set in, and politicians were beginning to look a little tarnished. Artist Fahmi Reza responded to the prevailing mood with this image. Only Dr. Noor, the Director General, remained culturally heroic. People sent him birthday wishes. He is the only obviously heroic character in COVID Ball Z, an anime comic and video by the artist A Bro Like That Bro.
COVID-19 overexerted his last attack. Are our heroes on the cusp of victory?
What's wrong, COVID-19? Your attacks have slowed down a bit. You seem out of breath.
Shut up! My infection power is now over 5,000! I am the virus of the century! I can only get stronger! How is this possible? How are you so strong?
You are not fighting the strength of one man. You are fighting all of Malaysia. Also, everyone is playing their part because the future is worth fighting for.
The arts and culture sector were badly hit by the pandemic. Within months of the lockdown, 93% of people working in the arts reported unemployment and/or a severe loss of income. The new Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture came under fire when she admitted on national TV that she did not have any comprehensive plans in place to prevent a complete meltdown. However, A town hall in June with a new Minister of Finance and a few dozen people from the arts and culture sector led to a discussion of Korea's success story. Parasite, the Oscars, the long-term vision for local Korean arts seemed to make an impact on the minister about the economic benefits of the arts. At a recent forum in October, spearheaded by My Creative Ventures under the Ministry of Finance, the discussion was much more robust in terms of arts and culture being part of a creative economy. Now, while I'm wary of touting the value of the arts in only this way, I wonder if the Ministry of Finance, with its clear-cut, market-driven desire to cash in on the arts, may be a better way forward and a better place to be than a ministry which wants the arts to align to notions of cultural identity, which are so often contested, and where it can too easily serve as a museum of cultural expression or a mouthpiece of whatever identity politicking is in vogue. With Malaysia's multi-ethnic and multi-religious identity and multiculturalism itself under threat for years by a government which made pluralism and liberalism bad words, it will be interesting to see if arts aligned to commerce and international market forces will possibly be set free. Certainly our animation industry, bouncing merrily between the US, Europe and Korea, and free of cultural politics, has thrived for this very reason. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to see arts and culture in purely utilitarian terms or as essentially competitive. To say we should be as good as Singapore, better than Indonesia, aspire to be like Korea will only take us so far. We need instead to know why we want to make art and what is the value of it to ourselves and to each other. And we need to be asking questions and having conversations not just about the economy, but of the kind of art we want and need to be making in these uncertain times. And this may not necessarily be art that is profitable, but it may be art which is necessary for the soul of the nation. At the forum, many speakers spoke of the need to pivot, and pivot we have in the way that artists have always pivoted. In The Seventh Seal, John's asks of the painter, what if people don't like the art you make? What if people don't want to see images of death? Then we'll paint them something else, something that makes them happy, he replied. Naked women, perhaps. Artists and arts have always had a healthy and sometimes cynical relationship to both power and money. And it might be a morbid thing to say, but pandemics and plagues can be unexpected beneficiaries. The Dutch painter, Van Dyck, was a struggling young artist when he was caught in a lockdown in Palermo, Italy. Plague had seized the city. Money and food were scarce commodities. But towards the end of the pandemic, the discovery of the bones of a young woman thought to be saintly, Rosalia, led to her sanctification as a plague saint. Van Dyck seized the moment, and his plague paintings catapulted him to fame and fortune. So yes, pivot. Artists, pivot. But it is hard to say while we're in the midst of the crisis, what will be the kind of art that will be made out of the crisis. Of course, art has been happening. Pivots have been happening all year, especially, of course, in the area of technology. Despite the lack of funding, artists have been moving their work online. Galleries are going virtual. The Georgetown Literary Festival is teaming up with Spotify to stream the festival. Even the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture stepped in and funded an online festival called Gerak Angin. Interestingly enough, that very My Creative Forum itself was forced to pivot. Because of a sudden and alarming spike in numbers, it went from being a live event to a semi-virtual event almost overnight. Why was this? Well, while Malaysians were being vigilant in flattening the curve, and Malaysians were willing to return to fairly normal routines, the political infighting and jockeying for power didn't stop. The attempt to shore up the tiny majority in Parliament led to a mistimed power grab by the Prime Minister. This led to a badly managed state election in Sabah that sent COVID numbers soaring to the anger, disgust, and fear of the people, as hospitals and frontliners quickly exhausted their resources. Returnees from the election spread the virus in the peninsula. They were blamed for the cases spiraling. One past leader who habitually did not wear a mask infected the very COVID task force he was on, forcing all the ministers, including the Prime Minister, into quarantine. Artwork by artist Fahmi Reza took a darker turn with this piece, which depicted the past leader as a center of contagion. Long simmering anger towards the backdoor government came to a head when the Prime Minister went on TV to say there was no double standards in administering SOPs, and jokingly added at the end that Abba, or Dad as he had taken to calling himself, would administer the rotan, or cane, for those who disobeyed him. This was the last straw. But the next day, the hashtag #MutantOut was trending on Twitter. Malaysian politics has always been compared to wayang kulit, or shadow puppetry, and with its theatricality and shadowy goings-on, its lack of transparency, its betrayals, counter-betrayals, public spats, sex scandals, brotherhoods gone sour, epic battles, even killings and enforced disappearances, all with the cast of characters we have lived with for over 40 years, it all feels like wayang, or like some sort of long-running, insane soap opera. How can we artists cope with that? We can't, but we must. It's Trumpian, but for 40 years, there is fatigue. My theatre company has peddled in political and satirical comedy, a form of wayang orang, if you like, or wayang with people, mocking those in power by using their very own words for 30 years now. But sometimes it just isn't funny anymore. We began the pandemic with memes and jokes, but the mood has turned much darker now. Things move quickly in Malaysian politics, and who knows what the state of the nation will be by the time you watch this recording. I believe if our wayang kulit traditions had survived the fist to the gut punch of Parson UMNO in the 70s and 80s, I think our dalangs would have had a field day telling this story of political chicanery in ways that would have made us laugh. But the dalangs are not so robust anymore, and their work is less political and satirical than it used to be. But perhaps also the dalangs never had to deal with this level of anxiety in their community. How to heal such a community? Wayang has many elements. You have the main body of the story, the heroes and anti-heroes, the villains, the gods and demons, in their eternal struggle, and they play out the main narrative. Separate from the main narrative and not influencing the plot in the slightest are the wise clown characters. These characters, Pat Dogol and Pat Long, are the most beloved of the wayang puppets. They stand and watch the fighting, the wayang. They watch their lives being destroyed, people arguing for their souls. They make comments, they question, they make wisecracks. They shake their heads, they go home, they come back, they shed bitter tears, they laugh. They are us, the audience, the artists, the ones not in the main narrative, but watching, observing, setting things down for the record. In the early part of wayang, there's plenty of time for comedy. But by the end of the epic, the battle scenes dominate. These can go on for days. In Indonesia, during the tragic days of Suharto, the dalangs played these final battles, the Battle of Kurukshetra. So maybe now is not the time for comedy. Maybe the time has come for full-blown tragedy. Maybe audiences need us, the artists, to help them gnash their teeth and tear their hair and cry, or sit quietly and reflect. I'm struck by the melancholia of the art that is coming out of places much more hard hit by the pandemic. This image by Gili Ballistic of the USA uses gas masks from World War I in a modern context. And Du Yin Han in China has a kind of Sistine Chapel with people wearing hazmat suits, PPE, and masks. So I wonder, what do we want to make and what art do Malaysians need right now? They're not one and the same. Maybe they need to see images of death. Maybe they need to sit with their hands around a bowl of milk and strawberries. The knight in the seventh seal knows that death follows him. Death is ever present. Knowledge fills him with profound darkness and depression. His life is full of anxiety, devoid of meaning. Black Death has killed his hope and love, because with pandemics, a loved one can fall ill and die at any time. Living with this kind of anxiety has a profound effect on our psyche. Every cough sets our heart aflutter. So what is the place of art and culture in this time of grief and loss, this time of anxiety, this time of huge change? I don't want to see pandemic art, a friend said, when I casually said that I was considering doing a staged reading or adaptation of Camus' The Plague. But the truth is, the crisis facing us is not just COVID-19, but an environmental and capitalist crisis of unimaginable magnitude. Environmentalists have been saying all year that this pandemic could give us the opportunity for a reset, a rethink, to rethink the sustainability of the way we do business. Because the COVID crisis has shaken the older generation in a way the crisis of climate change shook the young. Unlike climate change, the effects of COVID are immediate, visible, and devastating. The body becomes sick. Then, as the bodies pile up, the mind collapses. This pattern has happened time and time again in history. Much art has come out of it. So how, as artists, should we talk about the massive crisis facing us? I think we need to talk in more existential terms and not just in the utilitarian terms of political economy. We don't need to talk about the economic crisis facing those of us in the arts and culture sector as much as we need to talk about the crisis facing humankind and what role we as artists should play. We need to not ask questions about how we can best return to the old normal, and instead ask what is our current grief and loss, and how are we best coping, if we are coping at all. We need to enable artists to make art that ultimately will be healing for a fractured and lonely society. We need to talk about our pain, our loss, and our mental health. This is not to say that artists are psychoanalysts or priests. No, we ourselves are in pain, in crisis. We ourselves are dealing with mental health issues. The work that we make comes from that place of understanding, of suffering, or of at least having empathy for suffering. And artists have long held the responsibility of dealing with emotion, for dealing with pain. Whether it is Munch's paintings of death during the 1918 epidemic, or Schiele's self-portrait of himself, his wife, his unborn child, we have found sanctuary in common images of suffering. We're not alone, the work seems to tell us. At least someone understands. And we can be alone with others, contemplating our human fragility. In Malaysia, the traditional arts have long held a shamanic role of healing the psyche, of healing the community when it experiences loss and grief. It has a tradition of negotiating the terrain between life and death. The traditional Malay folk arts of Main Putri, Mak Yong, Kuda Kepang, and Wayang Kulit traverse the spiritual and material world without cultism or fuss. These are folk arts, and so they speak deeply to us as folk, as human. Unlike the court arts, which were to entertain royalty and the elite to pass the time on monsoon nights, to keep boredom at bay. The folk arts were more local, more subversive, more funny, more dangerous, more tragic, and more questioning of the world. It had at its central core the twin spectres of sickness and death. We know the final scene in the Wayang Kulit, Mahabharata, is the battle that ends the world. I believe traditionally that arts and culture is that necessary terrain where we expose our vulnerabilities and our fears, and where our complex desires beyond the full rice bowl can be more fully explored and given shape, form, and articulation. I also believe that the spaces where art and culture are made and practiced are essentially egalitarian spaces, where we can come together in our common humanity to be with each other and share friendship. Of course, it was for this very reason that these traditional arts were deemed dangerous in the 1980s by an authoritarian UMNO federal government and a religiously zealous past state government. Between them, they managed to almost destroy the foundation and practice of the traditional performing arts in Kelantan and Terengganu. The reason for their ban and the sidelining was that these arts were un-Islamic or pre-Islamic. Whatever the reasons, we need to look back at our traditional arts not as a form, but as a dramaturgy. for the future, which is why the work of Pusaka, an organization committed to documenting our cultural heritage, is vital for us as we go forward. So perhaps we need to talk in metaphors and images and stories, and we need to talk about the role art and culture has played and must continue to play when we face a crisis. The crisis is not only of COVID-19, but climate change. The crisis that is facing us is one of grief, ecological grief that has been creeping up on us, existential grief with the specter of death and loss of the world as we have come to know and understand it. For hundreds of years, death and plague stood down. It wasn't an ever-present specter. Now it is as present in our lives as it was in the lives of Shakespeare and Van Dyck and Virgil. What will we make of it? What did they? Many have talked about the need the world has to shift. Climate change scientists have been sounding the alarm for years. Politicians and economists have by and large said that the brakes that scientists wanted to put into place were impractical and impossible. But COVID-19 forced their hand and showed them this wasn't so. So do we really want to return to the old normal? Or do we want to face this existential crisis head on with as much resilience as we can muster and find out what the new world might be? The Indian epic, the Mahabharata, which is the basis of the Wayang Kulit, is the inevitable hurtling of humanity to the end of time. In this case, it is politics and the personal feuds that have devastated the land and created a civil war. Mistakes, betrayals, the humanity of man leads inevitably to the great final battle and the end of humanity. Is this the end of the line for sapiens? The Mahabharata seems to ask. Yes and no. Death is also present, and while we spend our lives cheating death, it follows us like a faithful companion. This is not to say that the role of art and culture is to be leaders of doomsday cults. Quite the contrary. We are not the priests of Seventh Seal inciting followers to self-flagellate. It is perhaps to be the third, more intuitive eye on the world. Looking at the history of art and culture can give us some perspective. This is not unprecedented. It's just that we haven't had to face death on this scale for a very, very long time. Why did it have to be now? A friend asked me. Why our generation? It's not fair, she said. It may be new, but pestilence always is man-made. It's a product of living crammed together in cities which allow contagion. If the Pied Piper is death, then even the absence of rats cannot save mankind. Children will perish as long as the Pied Piper is there. Throughout history, outbreaks have always been reflected in art and paintings. Artists have created work on the form of the disease, but also its impact on society. The plagues in Europe shaped European art. The way in which COVID-19 shapes our work remains to be seen. Shakespeare, for example, lived through 2 great plagues that closed his theatres for years on end, but he didn't write directly about the plague, except to use it as a metaphor for all that is bad. A plague on both your houses, cries Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. Instead, writes Stephen Greenblatt in a New Yorker article, Shakespeare focused his attention instead on a different plague, the plague of being governed by a mendacious, morally bankrupt, incompetent, blood-soaked, and ultimately self-destructive leader. In his book, The Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio's 3 men and 7 women escape from the plague in Florence. Holed up together in a villa, they keep each other's spirits up by telling each other stories, 100 of them, some foolish, some wise, many to do with love, more to do with lust. I think Boccaccio knew that in a time of plague, we need to escape from the real world. We need fictions to keep us going, fictions that hopefully will not end. When confronted by the fragility and frailty of the human body, maybe we need stories that are full of lust and life. Boccaccio also wrote during the plague about the anti-immigrant and anti-Semitism of the time. Jews were blamed for the plague and massacred. Later, in later outbreaks in the late 16th to early 17th century, this fear was transferred to all outsiders. Shylock in Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice is a target of such anti-Semitism and xenophobia. So it looks like xenophobia is a divisive topic. too divisive even for artists to properly explore. For all its globalism, the world is increasingly nationalistic. It is folly. Foreigners around the world have become the target of xenophobic attacks. So Chinese and Korean eateries in the US have seen a drop in business. In Rome, a cafe near the Trevi Fountain has banned all people coming from China. In Malaysia, Rohingya communities are being shut out of mosques. The plague and COVID has simply acted as a catalyst for existing racist and xenophobic beliefs to spread. But COVID has another kind of horror, the horror of the body. The plague paintings of Europe gave us images of the chaos of the time. Hungry dogs roamed the street, skeletons, miasmas, disgusting open wounds on the dying, enemies and devils at the gate. COVID-19 doesn't give us the piles of rotting bodies, but the body wrapped in silence, sanitized. The sanitary, the coldness, the blue masks, the plastic PPE, the human faces and bodies distorted by tubes and plastic shields, the isolation, the Zoom room, the screen, the seeing but not touching, the disembodiment, the disappearance of the body, the inability to connect to our own bodies and the effect of that on the mind, the mental illness that is never very far behind. And loneliness is another element of the pandemic. Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe out of the plague years. His hero is in isolation. He's cast away on a desert island. The loneliness and lack of companionship becomes unendurable. His friendship with Friday is what saves him. Aristotle said that we are all social animals. People need people. Our gatherings in sports stadiums, theatres and public squares is vital for our collective well-being. We don't just need family, we need friends. Disinterested friendships, it has been argued, is the building block of strong communities because they are built on the idea of this disinterested common good which allows us to thrive. It is kita jaga kita. The loss of friendships during pandemics has led to depression and despair. Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, describes the loss of friends as creating the greatest misery and dejection of mind. You could not visit the sick, he wrote, because to do so was to ask for death. And the sick friend died forlorn, bereft of human companionship. These are familiar words and images. Of course, today Zoom, Skype and FaceTime allows us to see each other, but it is still hard to express friendship through these mediums. And the expressions of these are necessary for both our mental and emotional well-being. Even Adam Smith, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, wrote about our need for expressing friendship. He called it sympathy. However selfish man is, he wrote, there are things in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, rendering their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Pity and compassion, he says, is felt even by the greatest ruffian. I think this crisis will eventually create work that will show us the extent of the tragedy. It will be the small stories of loss and grief that will move us. We would have experienced those losses ourselves. In Wayang Kulit, we don't really mourn the death of the epic hero. We mourn the passing of Pat Dogol and Pat Long. With Sang Kanchil, we want Sang Kanchil to survive the crocodile. If Sang Kanchil were to die, it would be unendurable. In her book, The Spanish Flu, Laura Spinney writes how the Spanish flu of 1918 was remembered personally, not collectively, not as a historical disaster, but as millions of discrete, private lives. So too now are we living lives of quiet desperation and private tragedies. The public spaces of art and culture where these can find expression are shut. We do our best to take it online, but there is something dystopian and Big Brother about the life lived through the screen of our living rooms. It is too early to see yet the art that will come out of this crisis, or to see how culture will be changed by it. The history of pandemics tell us that there will be profound and far-reaching changes. The plague in Hong Kong in the 1890s brought about not only better sanitation but democracy and equality, as the miasma proved to be borderless between rich and poor, colonizer and colonizer. Perhaps the art that comes out of COVID-19 will allow us to look at how connected we are globally. Perhaps it will allow us an understanding of death and allow us to have sympathy and empathy not only for our fellow man, but for the environment that sustains us. The reaction to the documentary on Netflix, My Octopus Teacher, makes me think that grief and loss will take us towards a better understanding and empathy of others, whether human or animal. Perhaps artists will now, more than ever, try to see art as not confined to national borders, that friends exist as far away as Sweden, and what affects them there affects us too. Perhaps artists will make work that reflects even more the borderless world we are inhabiting, and we can go past the anti-immigrant sentiments that are part of the exhausting nationalist narrative. Because if death is stalking us, we can only have empathy and understanding for our fellow human being. We can only share a bowl of milk and strawberries and wait our time out in the sun.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry about the time lag in the playing of the video. Apparently there is a common issue when sharing video in Zoom, and there's nothing more than we can do about it. And also, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards for public viewing. So this 40-minute keynote speech that you watched just now was recorded and edited by our partner, KiniTV in Kuala Lumpur. So the next 50 minutes or so will be a combination of discussion and Q&A. Your video and microphone have been disabled. To submit a question to the panel, please do so via the Q&A buttons on your screen. So let me first warmly welcome our speakers today, Joe Kokatas and Simon Soon. Thank you, Joe, for delivering such a moving talk and sharing with us your profound insights on the role and the meaning of arts in a time of crisis. So although we are kind of in the same Zoom room right now, I thought I should let people know of our geographical location right now. So I'm now in Canberra, Australia, and it is 1:45 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and Joe and Simon Soon, they're in Selangor and KL, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and it is 10:45 a.m. Kuala Lumpur time in the morning. So this year we're doing the ANU Malaysia update slightly differently. Not only that we're moving it online, but also because of COVID, but also of the fact that we for the first time, we do have a culture update. And so for the past 2 days, we have listened to the political and economic update, in which I believe we had very engaging and substantial discussions with the panelists and the audiences. And I have no doubts that today's session will be exciting as well, since we have both great speakers with us today. So the theme of this year's update is alternative visions for Malaysia. And so when it comes to envision or visualize our future, we cannot ignore or underestimate the role of the artist, whose ability to imagine our future world more boldly and critically allows us to also make sense of and reflect upon our current world and the situation that we are facing right now. And so to save more time for discussion, I won't say much. And now I will cross to Dr. Simon Soon, our discussant, to give his response to Joe's talk. Simon has about 15 minutes. And after that, we will proceed to our Q&A for about half an hour. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Ying Sing. Thank you, Joe, for the beautiful lecture. You're an amazing and beautiful thinker as always. So Assalamualaikum and Selamat Sejahtera to everyone. Now, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Orang-Orang Asli and Asal, who are the traditional custodians of the lands we meet on today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, while also acknowledging the Orang-Orang Asli and Asal joining us today. I'm participating today with a view of the world and whose sightline of history is entirely blinkered. As an academic, I was guilty before of contributing to the astronomical increase in the global carbon footprint. owing to a frenzied and, in hindsight, quite punishing traveling schedule, often requiring me to jet to different parts of the world. Today, however, I'm going to share my screen here. My view is very much reduced to this view from my balcony. It is a view that speaks to me with increased resonance over the past month, and I'm inviting you to think alongside this view in my response to Joe Pukata's powerfully cosmological lecture. We begin with the buildings in mid-ground, not least because in my 20s, I was quite prone to take long drives along Malaysia's snaking highways, and the PJ Trade Center was a building that greets me singularly on my northward drive out of town on the LDP. Designed by architect Kevin Mark Low, the 20-story ventilation blocks on the eastern facade here towers as a brise soleil screen, shielding the offices from the glaring sun, and over time, grows increasingly into a garden green lattice. The architecture exemplifies what Low calls a tropical monsoon paradigm, allowing sun, rain, and fungal growth to redefine what he terms the violent grace and humid aesthetics of monsoon Asia. I bring this building firstly into relief, principally to also note that amidst its verdant landscape, it not only houses the Revenues Office, but also two agencies relevant to our discussion here, My Creative Ventures and the Cultural Development Agency Cendana, who are principal executors of the creative economic development agenda that Jo Pukata mentioned in her lecture. Situated in the stylish office block, these institutions stood for an ideal that is by turns, at times also a kind of hubris, that the violent grace and humid aesthetics can be pruned and tamed into a landscape and architecture through the statecraft of cultural development. In turn, they shape the way we speak of the arts and justify the arts' relevance on political terms. At times, I wonder if this remains the principle or only way we know how to be political these days, couched in the managerial language of cultural leadership. The arts exist not as competing forms of storytelling that can help frame ideas of belonging. Instead, it survives anxiously in fits and starts about the worries and concerns of capitalism, funding, international recognition, sustainability, professionalization. And it is here that I want to draw your attention to other elements in the photograph of the view. Notice the incomplete and abandoned construction site in the foreground of a gigantic residential commercial complex that the apartment I live in is situated in. It is a newer and more recent development, but it is also much more dilapidated. Separated by the highway from the much more paradisal oasis, here lies not just the young couples, the salarymen, the representative buyer, or the taiko on Taobao, but also that I have discovered there are musicians, filmmakers, designers, and other creative communities, drawn perhaps to the affordable rent and to the large enough space for us to do the thinking work so that ideas can take root. As close as we are to this neighboring center of planning and coordination, I think it is this other parallel ecology and the plural attitudes to life that sustains them that I'm continuously drawn to think alongside with. When planners coordinate in the sheen of their corporate offices, I often wonder if the number crunching ever do really come to terms with the lived reality of its very close by neighbors that it professes to be concerned with. Maybe it doesn't really matter. What matters is, however, in moments of mental anguish, such anguishes that emerge from the loss of the world we thought of as stable, and we continue to sort of like explore through new experimentations. My sense is when we speak of policies in our current time of crisis, surveys and feedback forms don't always do the deep ethnographic or art historical work of dwelling with the sense perception of what compels artists to continuously create. When we speak of funding solely as dispensation of state-sanctioned largesse, I wonder if these measures really ask what kind of environment or architecture does it take to foster creativity? what enables artists and cultural workers to continue to create, subvert, channel, make claims, or in today's parlance, to hack, is because ultimately, as Joe suggests, we are sustained by stories. And my understanding is that stories allow us to understand actions and events in moral terms. This is different from thinking on ethical grounds, for social norms are not always permissive of new ideas and new ways of living. It is also not to concede to legal discourse and frameworks as the sole determinant of what is right and wrong, often spelled out, very often in black and white terms. Rather, stories come alive through a competing paradigm. It is like the back and forth banter of the Koran response dendangan, syair or pantun, to claim one's existence. The language of law courts and politics are only recourses that are often available to those who are familiar with the languages of these institutions. Storytelling, however, speaks in many different tongues. It is therefore morally democratic. Paying attention to this space of reckoning with our lived reality allows us to recognize the demos as active interpreters, negotiating with larger social forces and institutions that sometimes confuse the agency of creative will. And I want to speak through the example of the Borea, a project I'm working on, of a traveling minstrel party that used to entertain Penang society in the early 20th century. Typically, a Borea party begins with their song and dance, with a sing-song refrain. The refrain you see here in the middle is recorded in 1920. Let's take a closer look at it. I translated into English as, soldiers from Yunnan and Guangdong are not so different. They have resigned from China, out and about in search of riches, turmeric. The children of Padang Garam are safe and sound. The four-line chorus is representative of Borea's musical form. Typically, the first line announces the chosen team. In this case, a Chinese team was selected, and when outfitted, it would have resembled the troop photograph here that included a lion dance. The second line will elaborate the community event that is being mined, and in the third line, an interesting shift happens. Here, the condition which compels action is spelled out. Finally, the refrain ends with a declaration of aspiration and an allegiance to place. In the Shai's A rhyming scheme, the seemingly unconnected lives of deserting Chinese soldiers and a Malay community living in a fringe settlement of Padang Garam on Kimberley Street, Penang, became intertwined. What is interesting here is that there is an imaginative repurposing of the emerging field of anthropological knowledge. The soldiers from Yunnan involved in the chorus could well be a claim to a lineage made by the children of Padang Garam. Anthropological knowledge had begun to circulate a new consciousness of origins and of the migration of stock ethno-linguistic groups of people. The idea of Malay or Austronesians originating from Yunnan might have taken hold in the popular imagination. Instead of simply accepting the imperial categorization of the world according to racial types, we see this knowledge being playfully repurposed in a poem about alliance making, an escape not only from the confines imposed by British Imperium, but also by that of the Chinese. When the state fails them, people have remarkable ability to turn to one another to create a different language of living with one another. In making their way out in the world in search of riches, what they hope to find is symbolized by the turmeric, an allusion not only to material wealth, but also spiritual fulfillment. And I think thinking through Borea's formal literary structure, I cannot help but connect it to the manner in which Joel Kukatas assembles together a cosmic story of sustained empathy and war-making that went through Ingmar Bergman's Seven Seal, flits alongside the wildly Sangkanchel, restages the perennial epic battle between light and dark in the Wayang to illuminate what is most pressing about our current existential, social, political, and ecological grievances. Recognizing these themes are not distinct and separate issues, but fluid aggregates that allow us to scale the local towards a consciousness that can best be described as planetary. Stories told this way exemplifies a much more permissive vocabulary where words are animated to draw new connections and shape new reality. Or as Joe seems to be suggesting, stories told in this manner really gives us the best chance to compete, to make claims of injury, and find healing through the process of play. For this mode of thinking allow helps us to gain an intuitive eye on the world. Here is where we turn our eyes finally to the background, what is beyond. There are two things to pay attention here. First, I want to acknowledge what is hidden from view, a past that the belt of trees either eclipse or continue to haunt us with. The development that tamed the violent grace and humid aesthetics of the tropics equally is a process of systemic displacement of the Orang Asli community who originally settled in this area. By underlining this, I want to acknowledge that in our discussion of culture that is living, that is continuous, that is rooted in some idea of place, we need to reckon with the cost of this mentality of developmentalism that is often swept under the rug and remains undiscussed. What appears in this view is, however, a foreboding cloud-filled sky. And I turn to the 1980, where cultural critic, who at the same time was a bureaucrat, that perhaps art managers today could learn a lot from, Allahyarham Ismail Zain, he concluded in his sprawling lecture, Seni dan Imajan, Art and the Imagery, with the following passage, and I quote him, "In the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia, around the month of October or November, depending on when the monsoon season begins, one sees an arching, seething wave of clouds rolling in from the South China Sea, heading out towards the beach. The traditional community of the East Coast often connected the shapes and forms of the incoming cloud, flooding the sky that is still presently blue, with the imagery of the procession of Sema and his military cavalcade. The figure of Sema in Wayang Jawa, patronized by the Kelantanese court, is often recognized as that in a regional clown or trickster figure introduced into the epic cycle that has origins in South Asia. Sema, like Pak Togo, in the folk variant known as Wayang Siam, is the divine figure who embodies liminality between opposing poles, male, female, wisdom, fool, divine, profane. But for Ismail Zain, the appearance of Sema in the form of rolling clouds to the people of the peninsular East Coast signifies a moment of perceptual recognition. Here is an example of how a cultural community is able to identify new visual patterns as they learn to see the natural world through language and mythology. In this sense, what Ismail Zain is also suggesting is that the active and critical work of interpretation is not limited to the activity of translating vision and ideas into the language of corporate ruble. In doing so, we might have already conceded defeat. Rather, acquired visions are produced through what he calls perceptual psychology of the chance image that stems from the active participation of a community who is sustained by a vocabulary to be diviners and even meteorologists on their own terms. By ending his lecture with this dramatic imagery, Ismail Zain in turn summarizes what he had been trying to do with the lecture. While the lecture first appears to be prospective, sprawling, and inconclusive, a number of ideas prevail, principally the privileging of local over the nation, the preference of cosmologies instead of country. Instead of advancing a theory about Malaysian art, Seni dan Imajan locates the conditions where artistic vision is able to fulfill a kind of understanding that he calls syncretistic rather than analytic. Marshalling example from cave paintings, Dongson drumwares, to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, from Zen paintings to rock art in block postcards, Ismail Zain's cultural references not only span geography and time, they also span the neat divisions of art, craft, and popular culture. In turn, this store of cultural resources was viewed as an inheritance for the contemporary artist. For Frederick Jameson, who is a cultural critic, the mishmash approach was characterized as a postmodern pastiche, a prevalent literary device in the 1980s, which he saw amounting to blank parody. Another critic, Linda Hutchin, disagrees and makes a different case for the implicit political critique and historical awareness in such parodic work. However, in both instances, the convergence of culture into a recitational mélange cannot be anything but ultimately parodic of a chaotic and pluralistic society overwhelmed with information and images. Ismail Zain had a different take on such assemblage in Seni dan Imajan. He describes such deployment of cultural reference from different contexts and sources as a creative form of syncretistic vision. For Ismail Zain, such vision is characterized by the reception of wholeness because it is multi-focus without the need to be analytical, in which visual concentration is directed at one specific spot. Instead, it is an all-over effect with the aim of embracing everything at once. And I come back to Joe's lecture. Listening to Joe's lecture gives me an approximation of the same syncretistic envisioning of the world, for it approximates the sublime terror of monsoon Southeast Asia, not as something that can be trimmed and pruned, but as conflicting poles to be embraced forcefully, existing one, and as the torrential violent graces of wind and rain, and the infected, on the other end, as the infected fungal seepage that are sediments of a humid aesthetic. In zooming in on these details, what I hope to have distilled from looking intently at this view is to convey what I'm seeing into a communication of rasa, which is what we're able to feel and discover, a language of common fragility and entropy, but also perhaps some kind of enduring courage. Perhaps this is what is meant by Jo when she speaks of the dramaturgy of the future. As blinkered as I am in my moments of isolation, with this view, that is all I have, I hope that by marshalling the same resources of talking in metaphor, images and stories, and staging them against a view that has become my own, I'm still able to speak across the divides of our screens, produce an account not only of our mournful losses, but also from our moments of despondency to discover a consoling glimmer of what we can gain through the imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for the beautiful response. Jo, you want to respond to Simon's response first, or you have anything you want to say?
Well, just very briefly, maybe just to say, you put it very clearly for me, I think, articulated things that I was just feeling intuitively. As you both know, I really struggled to write this paper. It's a struggle to write about grief and loss during a time of grief and loss is something that I discovered, but it did make me also, I think, become very aware that that we have to think in cosmological terms, and that I know that it was an idea of a cultural update as a national update, but I do agree with you and feel with you that we need to stop thinking in such narrow national terms all the time, because I think it does not. I think if this crisis is going to have any ability to shift us, then we have to see that the shift has to be much more massive than we are currently actually accepting. Yeah, and I think it's tough. It's tough because it's a big one. It's a big one. But I think we do need to think in those terms. And I think for a long time we sort of removed the spiritual component of our art making. It's always been there. I think it's something that we just sort of intuitively feel, but we don't necessarily articulate. And I think the time has come to articulate those things, because when you hear these words being thrown about, like sustainability, etc., what do they actually mean? It means care for the place that you live in. It's not just an exploitative relationship that you must have with each other and with the world. Yeah.
Exactly.
Actually, I was saying to Zinian earlier that when I first started writing this paper, I had the first image which I had on my paper when I was thinking about art and culture was maybe you can show this image that I sent you, the first image that I sent you. I had this on my paper for a very long time.
Oh shit, the economy.
So I thought, when you have massive changes heading in front of you, this is not what's uppermost in your mind, and yet this is what we talk about constantly, and I just found it quite absurd. So I just wanted to just share this.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, so it's actually very important to talk about. I like what Simon mentioned about the communication of rasa. How do we communicate the rasa? Because rasa, the feeling, is something that we felt on our own. How do you communicate the rasa with others? And I think Jo in her lecture also touched upon a lot on how do we make art through the kind of empathy, the humanistic notion that we have, especially especially during COVID, with witness the kind of xenophobic attacks towards the non-us, the other. And so, yeah, it's something that we have to think about. And just a quick reminder for everyone, if you have any questions or comments for Joe or Simon, please put in the Q&A box, and we will respond. I'll try to make them respond to the questions. And so maybe very quickly on just to continue from what we talked about just now from Joe's lectures and also Simon's response on how actually we try to traverse the boundaries of what is art. It's not like a rigid box that we can define a category that what kind of art that we want to make, but actually arts, it's kind of everywhere. It's in our daily life, and I think what Simon wants to show is that kind the mundane aspects of art and the unconscious reception of the beauty and the connection, the alliance making that we are witnessing. So I actually like to ask both of you that since Joe in your lecture mentioned about folk arts as kind of like wayang kulit, kudakabang, as opposed to court arts, or maybe in today's term like high-end arts that serve the elites. But how do we in today's context revive that kind of spirits of folk arts in today's context? And like because like what Joe mentioned in the lecture, wayang kulit today are less political and satirical than it used to be. But maybe it's different case in Indonesia right today. So, but maybe to ask this question in another way is that how do we make arts that speaks to the folks? If this is an important question to ask, and maybe from your experience.
Well, maybe I just jump in first to say that even when I talk about things like our traditional arts, we make a division here between traditional and contemporary in a way that I think they don't make in Indonesia. So when I did a period of research in Indonesia some years ago on traditional performing arts and its connection to contemporary art, and most of the artists I spoke to said they make there's no disconnection, that the traditional performing art is to talk about very contemporary things. And for me, I feel that the contemporary artists can just use some of the dramaturgy of the traditional arts, meaning that how we think, for example, as Simon says, in cosmological terms. That for me is the dramaturgy of the traditional arts, which I think we in contemporary theatre and contemporary performing arts and contemporary visual arts need to also perhaps be much more aware of. So I think that actually we do have those folk arts in contemporary theatre, contemporary arts today, but they just, and I call them folk arts, but the form is not the same. It may not have the form of wayang kulit, it may not have the form of boria, it may not have the form of mak yong, but they have the spirit or the dramaturgy of those arts, meaning that they are, as I say, they are for people, they are popular, they are subversive, they are edgy, they're provocative. They are not museum pieces, right? They're not art solely as repositories, I think, which is, I think, something which often, I think, when arts are funded, it's very easy to fund those sorts of arts which are seen as emblematic of our culture, but not necessarily speaking to us in a contemporary way.
Yeah. And to add to that, perhaps I have the feeling that we're often caught up in measuring our artistic achievements on civilizational terms, right? And we sort of speak on civilizational terms, then we're always trying to compare ourselves to what has been sort of achieved in the UK or in Western nations. So as a result of that, I think folk art or the folk or things that are happening on the ground is often brushed aside and thought of as rustic or rough on the edge, a bit vulgar. But I think, like what Joe said, they can also be very provocative, they're acerbic. And they're incredibly healing because I think they're often very funny.
Yeah, I think this is something which has been said in the last 30 years. I hear a lot that these things are not our culture. I mean, when Instant Cafe first started, one of the things that was said was, well, this kind of political satire is Western, this kind of political satire is not our culture. And yet when you look back at our actual traditional arts, what's behind them is this very, as I said, trickster art, prankster art, subversion, the clown characters. And as Simon has pointed out, the clown characters are always also the divine characters. The parodying of those in power is an old tradition here. And yet I think now we're being told it's not. And I think I would like a return to that. I think we need to sort of, and in this way it returns to folk, as opposed to those who are in power, in authority, who tell folk how to behave, or who tell artists how to make their art. Whereas I think artists have to be the ones who are, yes, getting money for their work because people want that work to happen, but who are quite happy to thumb their nose at the same people who are giving them the wherewithal to make the work. I mean, I can't remember the name of the poet now, but there's a satirist who wrote, unless you bite the hand from which you're fed, it will pat you on the head. And I think we have to get away from this sort of paternalistic, patriarchal, authoritarian, kind of top-heavy view of the artists, of, well, we need to take care of the artists. We need to kind of make sure that they're okay, because then the artists turn into people who are trying to please you, which is what was happening in the court system. Like the court system was to please the king. But the folk arts didn't really care about pleasing the king. They just told their stories. And they use metaphor to look like they're telling stories that, just like Shakespeare did, but tell stories which boosted the current regime, but actually was often quite fundamentally critical of that current regime as well.
Yeah, so looking a bit well, we were talking about folk art, but there is a question from the floor, which talks about also our past, our artistic past, that what could we actually learn from our past. So there's this one from Augustine Che, who asked that 2020 is certainly going to be a watershed moment because of the crisis. Recalling of the economic and political disruptions of 69, May 13, and also 97 nation financial crisis, which led to the Reformasi moment. So what do you think that contemporary artists can learn by looking back at how Malaysian artists responded or attempted to respond to these former crises? Can you think about any examples, or how do we learn from the predecessors who have experienced the crisis themselves, but although it's different kind of crisis?
Simon, do you want to take this?
Maybe just to quickly respond, I think we've made some strides in publications like Narratives of Malaysian Art, or Narratives in Malaysian Art, I forgot now. It's a 4-volume book that really prospects the different ways in which we can look at our past artistic history. Of course, this historical awareness is still very much limited to a very small group of people, and our oblivion to this history is something that perhaps cannot solely be addressed through the publication of academic texts. So I really appreciate and admire the work of Joko Gatas and Rahel Joseph, for example, in publishing children's books that allows children to access contemporary Malaysian art through a set of activities. And I think the book has just been re-released by National Gallery of Singapore, am I right? And I think that we need a much more concerted effort and a much more multi-pronged approach to communicating history and doing the kind of public historical work, rather than confining history to merely the speculations of the confines of the ivory tower.
Well, I think it's interesting you use the word oblivion, and I think it's a very interesting word that I think we are quite oblivious about our art history. And so what happens, I think, is that people, either in the private sector or artists themselves, are constantly kind of trying to reinvent the wheel because we don't know actually what a rich history we have. I've heard a lot of people talk of late about, Malaysia has got so much to offer. We have such a rich multicultural society. We can create hybrid art. But I feel that these things keep being said, but actually we don't know what they are. we don't actually know what those arts are. And I hear a lot of people in the private sector or those in kind of government-linked communities who are trying to strategize to work with artists say these things. But then I think, but where are the programs to actually let us as a public know more about them? Either through in schools or through educational programs, through any kind of outreach. So there's no sense of ownership of our long, actually hybrid arts in Malaysia. And I think we need to have that, because otherwise we have a kind of collective amnesia. And I think we can't move forward when we have amnesia.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think because we have such a rich and diverse history, I think it's very important to realize that we cannot write this history alone, or from the perspective of only one community, which tends to happen that way. It needs to be collaborative. And
it's actually
sort of like spin across culture and recognizing that intercultural moment as the base, as the unit of analysis for us, rather than thinking of in terms of cultural purity.
I always felt it's so difficult to write, an anthology or something on Malaysian arts or Malaysian literature. So one cannot write it alone because it's so.
How many languages can we learn? There's limit to what we can actually comprehend in terms of the diversity of Malaysia.
Yeah, exactly. So there is actually.
I just want to say that earlier, I think one of the things I said was that I think when we have a focus on the arts as being a commercial entity, then this is what gets lost, because artists are just constantly trying to just make the next work to be commercially successful. And the models that we are using at the moment of how to support or sustain the arts are all really, at its core, still very commercial ones, which do not allow this sort of collaborative, long-term processing, understanding, thinking of the way that we make art and of the arts that we have and the forms that we have to tap into at our disposal.
Yeah. So talking about the forms of how do we make art in such a current context, there is a question about performing arts. I think this is directed to Joko Kartas from Tavasakayam Supia about so performing arts actually require theoretical settings for its presentation or for the audience to fully experience the intended artistic output, and it's now being downplayed into whatever means that can be transmitted online method. And she asked, so if the trend of COVID is a long term, the theoretical presentation will also take a different trend. Do you foresee an appearance of new aesthetic output, or will be left with memories of glory days of the past for performing arts? I think this is about digital.
Yeah. It's a very important, very good question, of course. I think what I've noticed, and I'm doing this myself, is I'm trying to explore what this digital world is. At the same time, and I remember feeling at one point, I'm okay with this. I did a production of Zoom Para, and I was very happy that my work could then actually travel outside the Klang Valley. It could go to the rest of Malaysia, east and west coast of Malaysia. East and west of Malaysia, and that was kind of made me think, well, this is a very good thing. We can do this. I don't miss being in the rehearsal room. I don't miss kind of going to the theatre. I'm okay. But then I went to one performance at a place called Bobo KL, where on Malaysia Day, and there was a performance there on that night. And suddenly being in a room with other people and watching the show that day, I was suddenly kind of quite overwhelmed with emotion in a way that I can't really explain. I felt my whole body became alive again in a way that I felt my body had become quite dead for the last few months. And I've been thinking a lot about this, the impact of this flat land on all of us collectively, on all of our bodies and our minds as well. And it really was brought to me that day, listening to Sean Ghazi and his band sing on stage that night, because I could feel that coming into my body and bones. But at the same time, the reality is that we do have to use this digital medium in some kind of way. But I also think that maybe one of the reasons we're using this digital medium as much as we are is because we need to make a living. So we need to sort of keep going. And so I think about, for example, the plagues in Shakespeare's day, because the plagues kept shutting down the theatre. So when recently theatres were shut here, I thought, well, this is exactly what happened in Shakespeare's day. They would open for a few months, another outbreak of plague, then they'd be closed for like another 6 months, and open for 2 months, closed for 6 months. It's very hard then for people to put anything on the stage. But during that time, Shakespeare wrote some of his most iconic work. So this is also the thing. We have to go with what's going on environmentally. We cannot ignore this environment and say, well, we can just carry on working. And if you look at, for example, again, going back to wayang kulit or the traditional arts, you follow seasons. During the non-monsoon season, you're out on the seas, you're fishing, you're making your livelihood. Then during the monsoon season, you make your puppets, you cure the leather, you tell the stories, so that you actually go with the seasons in some way too. I wish here there was, when we think about sustainability, we think about the fact that you need to sustain the artist during this time when actually what we need to do is we need to create, but you won't necessarily see the fruit of that creation, so that we can take our time and we can spend the time doing research, doing development, doing thinking. I was talking to a friend of mine just last night who's a theatre director, and he said to me, I haven't done anything. I haven't worked. But I feel that in a way that not doing anything is very important. The idea of letting land lie fallow for the land to recover and heal itself so it becomes more rich in nutrients later when the time comes for planting is also, I think, a very necessary thing. And so I think this time can be used very valuably if we weren't just rushing to produce.
Yeah, I think this also answer one of the questions who asked from Mary about whether you can suggest suggest to make art and art practice sustainable in a time of grief and loss. I think you also answered to that. So maybe to Simon, because about digitalization, because Simon himself, as an art researcher, he has also been exploring the potentiality of doing research in a millennial style by making best use of digital platforms. But are we on the right track of digitalization, and what are the challenges?
I'm not a digital native. I have to confess, as much as I would like to be. But I always have this nagging suspicion whether a digital native might experience the digital medium differently from those of us who are more used to physical sort of forms of engagement. And perhaps they might be shaped by a different set of sense perception on how they interact with the screen. But I think increasingly also perhaps there are things that we haven't yet fully explored, such as, for example, the use of avatars or as interface for sort of like conversation and interaction, but also increasingly, I guess, virtual reality or augmented reality kinds of interfaces, right? I wonder if maybe, to return the question to Joe, is are we pushing the medium enough? Or do we not have the capacity to sort of do that at this point in time, and maybe taking a break and stepping back from it in order to recharge is probably the best way to go for now.
Yeah, maybe we
Can I just add something? I think that, I think, of course, we want to explore the medium, but I think when we think about, well, what is the art that's going to come out of this crisis? We can continue to make work on this new medium, this new digital medium, but we will be making work rapidly because we're just trying to embrace this new medium. But I wonder whether then that will stop us from actually making the work which is responding to this current crisis. Yes, we are going online, but we're going online with the same work. We're going online with the work that we did last year.
And at such a rapid pace.
Yes. So that's why I wonder whether, as artists, we are not using the time to actually respond, because it does take time to respond with art to something. I mean, Van Gogh was in Palermo for years before he did his first painting. But that is the painting that sort of was a necessary art that needed to get made and that then lasted through centuries. And whereas I don't know what he was doing to make a living at the time. I'm sure he was having to do something, or maybe just starving, like that cliche of artists. But the fact is that you need to go through this crisis for the work to emerge from it.
Yeah.
And you need to physically go through that crisis for the work to emerge from it.
Yeah, talking about that, actually, we couldn't avoid the support system that we have currently in place to support artists to have time to create their works. And so I think that also there are some questions about the creative industries. So one from Stewart Nixon about how do we attribute values in crisis, like the essential sectors based on economic, but not holistic contributions to well-being, like creative industry seems more important than ever in bleak time, but
apparently it doesn't really receive enough support. And this is also related to Kian Wong's question about has the culture work beyond that MOF meeting about economic values? Can art pivot from the racialization in the digital momentum? I think this is all related about the kind of prevalent dismissal of arts and artists in the society. But on the other hand, when people are at loss or isolation at home because of lockdown, we turn to art and artists seeking to be healed. But artists themselves are suffering. They are also at pain. So do you have any comments on that, on our support systems, whether it's sustainable for a robust culture economy?
Well, of course, there have been recently quite a lot of discussions about this. There was 2 meetings. There was a meeting with MOF earlier in June. Then My Creative Ventures had a forum in October a few weeks ago. And then there was another forum just a few days ago, all to discuss these things. But and of course, those meetings were about the idea of the creative economy and about sustainability. And I think today I wanted to sort of provide not that kind of argument, right? The argument of how we can, how government and private sector should work together to support the artists. I didn't want to frame it in that particular way because I felt that it creates a kind of top-down relationship. It's like the artists are suffering and we must find ways to help them through this crisis. Whereas I would like to put it the other way around. We are in a crisis as human beings, all of us, whether you're in the government sector or private sector, we're an artist. What can artists do to help us through this crisis? So I kind of want to see it in those terms, because then the artist becomes somebody who is necessary and who is essential. And then you will try to find ways to fund them. So all the artist really needs to do their work is to be well funded and to be left alone to do the work that they need to do. And, whether in the old system of patronage, when you sort of recognize, well, you need the artists in your society, make sure that they are creating. That's all that really needs to get done. I think all the other discussion, I think we often get sidelined by that discussion. And I think that it's time for us to actually realize that the artists know what they're doing. They just need to be given the support in whatever form.
Yeah. So Simon?
I think, I'm not privy to the discussions that Joe has been participating in. So perhaps I'm not as clued into the ongoing deliberations and conversations between the public and the government. But I think maybe in another context, what I sense is that in another there's a lot of handouts. There's some handouts that are being sort of dished out at the moment. And in another context, I think Professor Jomo has spoken of these dispensation as kinds of hands out that emerges in response to a system of political patronage. And my sense is, I'm not an informed analyst on this issue, but my sense is perhaps in the arts, it also sort of like mirrors this particular culture of political patronage. And I wonder if there is space to enlarge the conversation, to think about perhaps what other artists are also advocating for. I think artists like Sharon Chin have been going on about ideas of subsidy for housing, to make housing sort of affordable, to create a plan, a system where artists are properly housed so that they actually have a place to create and not worry about, paying their rent or seeking for shelter. And there are, maybe these sort of conversations need to be considered or brought into discussion in terms of thinking about how we're going to weather out the pandemic in a long-term basis. And I wonder if those conversations are, being included in our current deliberations.
Yeah. So, well, because we're running out of time, so we're coming to an end of our session. So it's really quick. But before that, I would like to invite Jo to share the works that her theatre company has been working recently, and hopefully we will talk about sustainability. And the theatre company has been also impacted by lockdown by COVID, and hope those who are interested can join the recent works that Joe's company is doing. So I can share screen. Yeah.
So this is a production that we were supposed to have done originally we were supposed to have done it in April, as you can see from the dates there. This is a production I've been working on with a company called Paris 2 Theatre. It's a collaboration. Paris 2 is a refugee theatre company, and the production was supposed to be in April, got postponed because of MCO. Then it was supposed to be in November, and the current CMCO has been postponed again. But we do hope that we will be able to stage it in December. So that's our new date. So this is what was postponed. But we also decided that, what is theatre, and we decided to give the audiences something to watch during the CMCO. So we decided to do a screening of a play that we did in 2016 called Nadira. And we using, again, digital platforms, saying, well, you can't go to the theatre, but we can bring the theatre to you. And this is happening on Saturday. And we wanted to do it just as a one performance, because we felt, what is the act of going to the theatre, but going together to something, being a community, saying, yes, we will make this a special event. We will meet you there, as opposed to watching it by yourself on Netflix, watching it by yourself, at home, but rather create watch parties, come together, just rediscover what it is to want to be with your friends. Even if you're meeting your friends online, you'll know that you're all going to be online at the same time. And maybe this will create a kind of community as well, and a sense that we're not as isolated as we are feeling right now.
Yeah, so thank you. I hope all of you can kind of get your ticket here, note down the website. And so we have come to an end of today's culture update, and also the entire Malaysia Updates 2020. So it is a real shame that we have to end our beautiful discussion this way by just, a click to end the Zoom meeting. We could have, stepped out of the room and have some more chat after that, but I guess this is how it works in digital era. So
the good old Australian fashion, have a glass of wine.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the full videos of the 3-day updates, including the lecture recordings and Q&A discussion, will soon be available online, and you all will be receiving an email when they're ready. So, and again, a big thank you to you all joining us today from all over the world, and a big thank you to Joe Kukatas and Simon Soon for your great ideas. And I will hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.